Good evening. I am very pleased to welcome you to today's program with Angela Stent and Daniel Snyder. Today's event is co-organized by the Commonwealth Club of California and the World Affairs Council of Northern California. I'm Russ Yarrow, member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, manager of public affairs at Chevron, and your chair for today's program. With developments in Ukraine changing by the minute, along with the shifting state of U.S.-Russian relations, our program tonight could not be timelier. Please join me in welcoming Angela Stent and Dan Snyder.
Well, good evening, and this is a case where events have more than caught up with Professor Stent's writings, and it allows us to, I think, take her book into not only in terms of its reflections on the past, but also what it tells us about the future. So why don't we dive right in at the big level and ask you that your book, the title of your book is The Limits of Partnership Between the United States and Russia. So if we look at the recent events in Ukraine, have we now gone beyond this, and should the book be retitled The End of Partnership?
Well, I sincerely hope not. Good evening. It's great to be in this audience and to have this discussion with you. In my book, I sought out to explain why it's been so difficult in the past 22 years since the Soviet collapse to create a productive U.S.-Russian relationship, and how successive U.S. administrations have had great expectations about improving the relationship, only to see these disappointed at the end of their terms. Now, this in the U.S.-Russian relationship this time under President Obama, it's ended earlier maybe than it did in either the Bush or Clinton administrations. I think you can't say it's the end of partnership, because we have to work with Russia. However difficult, we are the world's two nuclear superpowers. We have to work with Russia on pressing global issues such as Iran, Syria, right now post-2014 Afghanistan, and ideally things like the future of the Arctic and climate change and those kinds of issues too. So we can't say no more partnership, but I think at the moment we're obviously in a very, very low point, probably the lowest since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the issues, the current issue, which is the future of Ukraine, that's been one of the themes running throughout the last 22 years, is what do we do about the post-Soviet space?
Well, as you write in your book, the lines of conflict over the future of Ukraine were already, in some sense, they were beginning to be drawn at the point of the end of the Soviet Union. But certainly the events that we're looking at now can be dated back at least to 2004 and the Orange Revolution and the sort of subtle but fairly increasingly open conflict between Russia and the West over the future of Ukraine. Can you sort of give us your sense of how did we get from there to where we are today?
Yeah, well, obviously Russia and Ukraine have historically been bound up together since 1654, when at least the eastern part of Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire. Now, the other problem with Ukraine, as you probably know, is that the Ukraine we have today is a result of what happened during World War II. The western part of Ukraine, today's Ukraine, used to be the eastern part of Poland. In the interwar years before that, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so that part of Ukraine has spoken Ukrainian historically and has identified with Europe. The eastern part of Ukraine, again, was part of the Russian Empire. It was part of the Soviet Union. So when you created this Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic after the end of World War II, you already had these divisions, but they were submerged because they were all part of the Soviet Union. They were under Moscow's rule, and therefore the Western Ukrainians, they weren't really supposed to speak Ukrainian. They had to suppress a lot. Although, there were insurgent movements in Ukraine for a very long time after World War II as well. And complicating the history of Ukraine, because you're hearing this a lot from Russia, when the Nazis invaded Ukraine, some Ukrainians and some units welcomed the Nazis. They saw them as liberators from Soviet and Russian rule. And some of them joined, SS units and things like that. So that's all part of this very complicated history of Ukraine. Now, another complicating point is that in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev, in one of his harebrained schemes, decided that to celebrate 300 years of Ukraine and Russia being partners, Ukraine being part of Russia, he would give Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And for any of you who've read, Russian literature, Crimea features very much, think of Chekhov's short stories, very much integrally part of Russia historically, but it was given to Ukraine. Now, that didn't matter at that time because, again, it was part of the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was, I think, the most difficult for Russia to accept that Ukraine was a separate country. Again, because, there was so much intermarriage, that the two countries, the two republics had been so intertwined. And it was also hard to accept then that Crimea, where the Soviet Black Sea Fleet was headquartered, was now part of an independent Ukraine. It was difficult, but they did accept it. So 20 years ago in 1994, and I'm sure you've been reading about that too, there was an agreement signed between Russia, the United States, Ukraine, and Great Britain, whereby Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear weapons. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear state in the world after Russia and the United States. This was a very dangerous situation. They gave up their nuclear weapons, but in return they got guarantees for their security and their territorial integrity, and Russia signed that agreement. You fast forward 10 years, there were problems in Crimea in the 1990s. There were groups in Crimea, the predominantly Russian ones, who didn't want to be in Ukraine, but they still, all of the Ukrainians voted for independence in 1991. Then you fast forward to 2004, and you have the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. You have a falsified election, you have crowds out in the streets, and Mr. Yanukovych, who was Moscow's candidate then, won in a falsified election as a result of the U.S. primarily, but the Europeans refusing to accept the result of that election. There was a recount. There was a revote, and then Viktor Yushchenko won. And so for a few years, you had a government in Kiev that appeared to be more Western-leaning. And I'll tell you one more anecdote, because I'm sure you've also heard a lot of Russian criticism that the U.S. is behind, a kind of fascist government in Kiev. But in 2004, the Russian media were writing that the U.S. was responsible for encouraging people to go in the streets, but it was a combination of George H.W. Bush and George Soros. Because, of course, George Soros, through his Open Society Foundation, was funding some of the NGOs in Ukraine. And, of course, George Bush and his officials, they supported the Orange Revolution. And when I try to explain to Russians, you don't understand. George Soros actually spent an enormous amount of money trying to get George Bush defeated. and there's absolutely nothing that they would agree on, except maybe that. So, but this, I think, gives you a sense of some of the kind of conspiracy theories that have existed in Russia. And then I guess just to fast forward, so the Orange Revolution sort of squandered most of the goodwill and the capital it had really at the beginning. The two main characters, if you like, President Yushchenko and Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, spent so much time squabbling with each other. They didn't implement reforms. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. And then, of course, in 2010, Mr. Yanukovych was reelected. And I think the only other thing maybe to remind the audience is that during the Bush administration and during the Orange Revolution, there was some discussion of Ukraine getting a membership action plan to join NATO. At the Bucharest summit in 2008, Ukraine did not get that plan, partly because the Germans and the French and other NATO members vehemently opposed it. And at that summit, President Putin met then with President George Bush and said to him, "You don't understand, George, Ukraine isn't really a country. The western part of Ukraine was always in Eastern Europe, and most of Ukraine belonged to us." So, that message there was loud and clear. And then in 2010, President Yanukovych, when he came into office, said, "We're not interested in NATO membership. We were going to be a neutral country." Everybody accepted that. So actually nobody's been talking about NATO membership since then. And the only other thing to mention is that Yanukovych then negotiated with Russia a new deal on this Black Sea Fleet base. It was supposed to expire in 2017. Now it expires in 2042. And I'm sure, 2042. And I'm sure that when the new interim government of Ukraine suddenly emerged a couple of weeks ago and Mr. Yanukovych left the country, the Russians must have been pretty concerned about whether the new Ukrainian government would think about renegotiating that base.
So even given the Russian concerns about Crimea, And having been there, and having been to Sevastopol, I understand what that means to the Russians. But even then, I would say, having taken the step to send Russian forces into Crimea and holding this referendum on the potential independence of Crimea or the joining of Crimea to Russia is an escalation beyond the levels that the Russians have been willing to go previously. What do you think happens next, presuming they get the outcome that they're looking for?
Right. Well, I should also say, I think one of the reasons why Russia did this is because Mr. Putin thought that he had negotiated an agreement with Mr. Yanukovych in November, that Mr. Yanukovych would not sign an agreement with the European Union. He was going to accept a $15 billion loan, economic assistance from Russia. And he might have then thought about joining an alternative body that President Putin is trying to create, the Eurasian Union. And so President Putin thought that he had a deal worked out, and then when all of this happened, suddenly that deal was up in smoke, and the whole question of Ukraine's orientation was reopened. Plus, one of the first acts that this interim government did was to pass a law demoting the use of the Russian language in Ukraine. Now, that hasn't been implemented, but the parliament passed it, and I think that was also quite a provocative move, and I think that also fed into Russian decision-making. What do I think is going to happen? Crimea will presumably vote to join the Russian Federation. And then there's a question of how that's going to be implemented. There are various ways. I suppose it could become an autonomous part of Russia. There are other legal ways of doing that. And then I think the outside world will be presented with this fait accompli. And even though I very much doubt that either the United States or the Europeans or the Chinese for that matter, they have their own issues with separatism, whether anyone is going to recognize the incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation, will continue to deal with Russia, and those will be new facts on the ground. And I think that the thing that people are really concerned about is whether you could then have a spread of violence, or there could still be unrest in the eastern part of Ukraine, and so that all of this doesn't stop at Crimea.
So I think one of the big sort of questions that's now being discussed widely is what drives Russian actions in Ukraine. I think this takes us back to some of the themes of your book. And I sort of see two main explanations that are out there. One is that the Russians are acting based upon their fear of the encroachment of the West on what they consider to be their natural sphere of influence. That in some sense this began with the decision to expand NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that without Ukraine, whatever hopes the Russians have of being recognized as a great power, embodied perhaps in this Eurasian Union, would be dashed. So that Ukraine has this overwhelming strategic value for Russia. But the other idea that's out there is that what is really threatening is not so much the geostrategic side of this, but the prospect of a process of democratization within Ukraine itself, of Ukraine becoming a more democratic, a more open, transparent society, and therefore presenting a model in a brother Slavic state in a place that's closely tied to Russia of a way of governing that threatens the Putin's own vision and leadership of Russia itself. Where do you put those two ideas?
It's all of the above. So I think people can disagree on what is more important, but clearly you have to start with the domestic aspect. All of the post-Soviet states, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have developed somewhat similar types of government. It's different. It's more extreme in Central Asia. It's less extreme, obviously, the further west you go. But these are governments which are not very transparent, where you have very close relations between a small group of political elite and the economic elite, where assets, are owned by a small group of people, where the rule of law really isn't implemented at all. And so there are quite a lot of similarities there. And so during the Orange Revolution 10 years ago, I think that was one of the things that really really threatened some of the Russian officials with the idea that if Ukrainians could take to the streets, demand a less corrupt government, why couldn't they do that in Moscow? And that's why the Kremlin then created a new youth group that was supposed to fight against what they called fascism then, and to try and make sure that this didn't happen in Russia. And I think the same is true today. Now, I think to some extent, there are some Russians that are probably appalled by the specter of this kind of anarchy in the Maidan, of people going out in the streets, of there being no order. And they certainly show that on Russian television, so that maybe acts against it. But I think that domestic the sort of transfer effect that if it can happen in Ukraine, it could also happen in Russia, even though, Putin's very popular. His popularity went up 8% last week after the occupation of Crimea. That's certainly there. But then I think the other part of it's also important. And then you go back to, what did Gorbachev think that the West promised him at the time of German unification? Now, I've written another book about that some years ago, and I mean, I've looked into that pretty thoroughly, and nobody promised him that NATO wouldn't expand. He took a remark that then Secretary of State James Baker made, and I think he inflated it. I think maybe in the spirit of the times he thought that, but there are absolutely is no written promises. Nothing was said. What was talked about then was the fact that no NATO troops would go into East German territory when Germany was unified. So then NATO was enlarged, and I don't think it was a mistake to enlarge NATO, because I think that, the Poles and the Baltic states and the Czechs, they had a right to choose where they wanted to be. But I do think it was a mistake not to try and give Russia a stake in this and include Russia more. At various points, President Putin in the beginning of his administration, and Yeltsin before him, said that Russia would like a perspective of joining NATO. Now that seems impossible. But at the time, I think more could have been done. Even though we do have a NATO-Russia Council, we probably could have done more and been a little bit more creative, because certainly, ever since that happened, this is one of the major grievances you hear. And so I think that is something that's fueled the Russian resentment. But the Russians used to say they weren't concerned about the European Union. NATO was the enemy. But then they got very concerned about the European Union, because they understood that had Ukraine signed that agreement with the EU and had they implemented all of the tough economic measures and transparency and rule of law, again, Ukraine would have been a very different country, and it would have encroached in the post-Soviet space. So I think it's both the foreign and the domestic aspect of this. And I really think that Putin believed, particularly after 9/11, and I do go into that in my book, when he did phone President Bush, he was the first foreign leader to call to offer Russian support in the war in Afghanistan, not to hinder the establishment of American bases in Central Asia. I really think that he did think in return for that, the United States would recognize that Russia has a special sphere of influence in the post-Soviet states, and he sees exactly the opposite now.
So I want to explore a little bit sort of U.S. and European goals in this. And in your book, you talk about the Clinton period and the Kosovo crisis, which seems to me is an interesting prelude to this, in that Americans and Europeans are talking very strongly today about the issue of territorial integrity, not violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine in the case of the Russian move into Crimea. And yet, of course, the Russians raised the same questions about Kosovo and Serbia at the end during the Clinton administration. Is it fair to say that nobody has been particularly consistent on the issue of territorial sovereignty? The Russians also raised that, the inviolability of territorial sovereignty and integrity when it's convenient for them in other situations.
So in a sense, we've all not been consistent in this. You can start off with Chechnya, right? Why did the Russians march into Chechnya? Because they didn't want, the Chechens were trying to secede from the Russian Federation. And you may recall, and it's in my book, that at the time, in the beginning, President Clinton said that President Yeltsin was like Abraham Lincoln, and he wanted to, keep the Union together. But of course, the rhetoric then and the reality changed. For the Russians, Kosovo, that was what broke, that reset that President Clinton certainly had with President Yeltsin. What you can say about Kosovo is that, of course, in the end, the independence of Kosovo was a negotiated thing. It lasted for many years. The U.S. and the Europeans tried to get Russian agreement with this. They couldn't. And it was, and that, there was a vote on it. So there is some legality behind the independence of Kosovo, even though clearly not all countries recognize it. And so in this case, the Russians are drawing the analogy there. I don't think it's really a very apt analogy, because they, have marched troops in. I mean, they had troops in Crimea, but they marched all these extra troops in and by force took something over. And then they're having a referendum, which of course we say isn't legal, but then of course, they had a referendum in the Kosovo case too. So I think there's some inconsistency, but I think there are differences too. But there, a number of cases, in the world where you can start quibbling about, who supports self-determination when. I mean, you could also say if there's going to be a referendum in Crimea and a majority of people vote for independence, usually the United States, in most cases says, if there's a democratic referendum and the majority of people want one thing, we support them. Well, clearly here, we're not saying that. So there's a lot of inconsistency.
So there's been a lot of talk about creating an off-ramp for Russia, some way, face-saving way out of this. What would be the basis of a compromise to make our way out of this crisis?
Well, I think you can't really have an off-ramp compromise, first of all, until you get the Russians talking to the Ukrainian government, even because they're now saying it's illegal. So, I mean, I know they're backstage discussions going on, and I think the most important thing was, in order to start that, you have to at least get all these parties to sit down together, and the Russians have to sit down with the current Ukrainian government and then the one that's elected on May 25th and stop saying that it's an illegal government. I think you would also have to have the U.S. and its allies recognize that Russia has interests in Ukraine. It has interests in Crimea, and no one is trying to deny the ties between Russia and Ukraine, and particularly eastern Ukraine, and that everyone has to recognize this, and the new Ukrainian government has to recognize this too. And then there are various other, and then, the ideal thing would be to have international monitors go there, United Nations. Well, they did send one fairly high-level observer, and he wasn't able to gain access to anyone, right? He was kidnapped and then had to leave. They tried to send OSCE monitors, and my understanding is, unless the news is different today, that the OSCE monitors haven't been able to gain access. So you'd have to have neutral international observers go there. You'd have to negotiate, ideally, a gradual withdrawal of some of these Russian troops from Crimea. I think that's part of the, off-ramp solution to this. So it involves, complicated diplomacy. I know the British have tried to establish a contact group similar to the one in the former Yugoslavia, where you'd have regular discussions, US, Russia, Ukraine, France, Britain, apparently not Germany. So a variety of ways, but it would involve, reassuring the Russians that the outside world recognizes that they do have interests in Ukraine. And I think it would probably involve, and both Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski have suggested this in various editorials recently, probably saying that Ukraine isn't going to become a member of NATO and doesn't seek NATO membership, which it doesn't at the moment anyway, and that it can have a relationship with the European Union, but it'll have to be one, I guess, that's acceptable to all sides.
So you've been watching Russia for a long time. What's your sort of gut tell you about what Putin's state of mind is at this moment, about even his willingness to look for those kinds of ways out?
Yeah, right now it seems that he's quite furious about what's happened in Ukraine, that, he thought there was a deal, then they thought there was an agreement that was signed on February the 21st, whereby Yanukovych would have remained in power, and there would have been elections later on. So I think this has been very much a very, very strong reaction, and wanting to put down a marker that this can't go any further, and that Ukraine, at least part of Ukraine, has to be allied or part of Russia. So at the moment, I don't really see any room, anybody backing down at the moment. I think in the longer run, one has to assume that they will back down. But I'll come back to the remark that apparently Chancellor Merkel made to President Obama last week, which is that President Putin's understanding of what's going on is not the same understanding of what our understanding is. And it's possible that in the small group of decision makers around him, the information that he gets doesn't give him a full picture of what's happening. And I'm sure that that's fueling some of this too.
So in your book, and you referred to it at the beginning of your remarks tonight, you outline the fact that there are, substantial shared interests between the United States and Russia. And this is one of the things that I've vexed me for quite a while in thinking about this, because if you look objectively, they're on large, very important issues, whether it's the threat of Islamic extremism, nuclear nonproliferation, issues of sort of stability in the world system, because I think the Russians are, in some sense, a status quo power, as is the United States. And as you mentioned, other, even other interests, climate change, the Arctic, whatever. There are lots of areas where our interests substantially overlap. And you could construct a pretty credible scenario for in fact, a U.S.-Russian partnership, as you say, on all sorts of issues. In many ways, you could argue that there's more grounds for, or as much grounds for partnership between the United States and Russia as there is between, say, the United States and China, another great power. Why don't the shared interests have more weight in our relationship? And that includes the questions of economic and business ties. Why don't those carry more importance in shaping the way that we relate to each other?
Well, I'm going to start with the last point because you mentioned China. Huge difference between the U.S.-Chinese relationship and the U.S.-Russian relationship is the economic stakes, right? We do $500 billion of trade a year with China. We have a large private sector community here that's very interested in the Chinese market and that makes its views felt to the U.S. government. Our total bilateral trade with Russia is something about $40 billion. It's less than 2% of our total trade. One of the reasons for that is that what Russia exports, which is energy, we don't need Russian energy. And the other thing that Russia exports a lot of is military hardware, and we don't buy that from Russia. We bought a few helicopters, but otherwise not. So we don't have a natural complementary economic interest. On the other hand, we have some U.S. businesses, Pepsi, soft drinks and things like that, the automobile industry, Boeing, that have a very strong economic relationship with Russia. But because this isn't widely diffused, we don't have a broad group of stakeholders in this U.S.-Russian relationship. So it's very much a narrow kind of relationship, very much still focused on the nuclear issues. But on the other hand, we do have common interests. And we are able to work with Russia on those common interests, I think, where the Russians feel that we're treating them as equal partners in all of this, and where we appreciate that their definition of interests is somewhat different from ours, even if ultimately we share the same goals. And I think, let's take Syria as an example on this, where it's difficult at the moment. So on the one hand, you could say President Putin took the initiative last fall, before the fall, when the U.S. wasn't very resolute about what it was going to do in terms of what was happening in Syria. We have this process of chemical disarmament. Now, at the moment, that's not going so well because we've just suspended our military cooperation with Russia because of Ukraine. But that could change again. And we obviously have disagreed with Russia about the end of how the civil war ends in Syria, because the Russians still think that the best bet is to have President Assad in power because the alternative is al-Qaeda. But in the longer run, we probably both want a government in Syria that's stable and that's more or less secular, that isn't dominated by radical elements. But it's very hard for us to get there because at the moment, Russia supports Assad and we don't. And there are other areas where, Iran. We both share the goal that Iran not become a nuclear weapons state. And right now we are engaged with Russia in these discussions. And that's another reason why we can't let the relationship with Russia completely tank, because we need to be involved in these multilateral issues. But often the partnership breaks down there because the Russians feel that they're not treated as equals. That's still very much of a theme there. and that the U.S. tends to set more of the agenda than they do. So part of it is how you deal with Russia. And then maybe it would be easier to achieve these goals. But at the moment, we seem to be wide apart on many of these issues.
So in your book, you talk about 4 resets, that basically the last 4 American administrations since the end of the Cold War and the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, each engaged in some sense in a reset to try and find some basis of partnership. And each one, to some degree, failed. What's the problem here? Is it a problem of understanding? Do we simply not understand each other? Do we really have a fundamental clash of interests that just prevents us from reaching this kind of sense of partnership? Or are we sort of trapped still in the legacy of the Cold War, in perceptions of each other that are still founded in a certain degree of mistrust?
Well, I
and
think
you also mentioned, by the way, the role of the Congress in this, which I think takes us to the mistrust element quite directly.
I will address the question of Congress. So we certainly, are still, the Cold War legacy is still there. The mistrust, I mean, part of this is generational. It's not so much among the younger generation, but certainly, older people who lived through it, it's the mistrust there. Part of it is the legacy of how we see the 1990s, and that's another problem. We still tend, not all Americans, but many Americans tend to see the 1990s as a time of greater pluralism, greater freedom of expression, political decentralization in Russia. Most Russians, not all of them, but many of them, and this is certainly something that President Putin talks about a lot, see the 1990s as a time of humiliation, chaos, poverty in Russia. And again, Russia having to accede to an agenda which was dictated by the United States. So we see that and part of what Putin sees himself as having come into power and restored Russia's greatness, restored the respect of the world for Russia, and that against what happened in the 1990s. Now, of the 4 resets, let me briefly say that, interestingly enough, the brief reset under President George H.W. Bush, which only was a year because then he left office, is remembered quite well in Russia because it focused precisely on these issues where the U.S. and Russia were equals, and that had to do with the nuclear issues, disarming Ukraine of its nuclear weapons, and with the legislation of Senators Nunn and Lugar taking care of nuclear materials, nuclear scientists, helping Russia in that very important transition phase. And there was really very little attention paid to what was happening domestically in Russia. President Clinton is remembered less positively in Russia, again, because of this view of the 1990s. And I think, it founded, and again, we come back to these issues we already talked about, the Balkans. Russia feeling that it had to accede basically to policies that were NATO policies, where it really disagreed and where its equities were threatened. NATO enlargement to Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, the bombing of Serbia. And so that's, again, where it founded. And there I think it's because we had a fundamentally different view of what a Europe whole and free means. And now the third reset, as I point out, was actually initiated by President Putin when he called President Bush after 9/11. I mean, they'd met in Slovenia, and President Bush had looked into his eyes and gotten the measure of his soul. Then a remark which he writes in his memoirs he later came to regret, mind you. President Putin did offer assistance in the war in Afghanistan, and for a while that worked. I mean, the fall of 2001, President Putin visited Washington, he visited the ranch in Crawford, and there really seemed to be a coincidence of interest and a partnership there. That all came apart once you start with the Iraq War, the color revolutions, NATO enlargement to the Baltic states, and then finally the Russia-Georgia war. And again, it comes back to those questions of Russia's rights and influence in its backyard. And with the Obama reset, to the extent, and it was successful in the first term, it did achieve, again, it's an arms control agreement, which was the Russians, where they felt, again, we were negotiating as equals. Tougher sanctions on Iran, where the Russians were willing to compromise, they hadn't wanted them. Agreement on this northern distribution network, which has facilitated carrying material and troops to and from Afghanistan at a time when our relationship with Pakistan was deteriorating. But that reset was very much based on the personal relationship between President Obama and President Medvedev. And they, by all accounts, got on well. They're a younger generation. Even if one understood that Prime Minister Putin, as he then was basically still the chief decider, the fact that these two presidents interacted together apparently helped things really work. And so things then start to come apart when Mr. Putin announces that he's coming back to the Kremlin. There are demonstrations in December of 2011 against the Duma elections, which the Russian opposition said were falsified. He then blamed Secretary Clinton for paying demonstrators to go into the streets. She then accuses him of things, and then you get this kind of tit for tat. And then, again, everything spiraled very much downwards, ending, of course, with Russia granting political asylum to the NSA leaker Edward Snowden. And that was the absolute low point, before Ukraine.
So let me turn to some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
And many of them revolve around the U.S.-Russian relationship. But let me start with one that doesn't, and that's energy. And that's a chapter of your book as well. And of course, in Ukraine, one of the crucial questions is Ukraine is the transit route, still the predominant transit route for Russian gas supplies to Europe. How much does energy policy, and particularly for Russia as an oil and gas exporter and an economy that's still overwhelmingly dependent on the returns it gets from its energy resources, play in the formation of Russian policy and in their reactions to the West?
It's an excellent question. I will begin that answer with a story from my book. So I've been part of a group, and for 10 years, we've gone to Russia every year, and we've had dinner with President Putin. I think maybe once we had lunch. And at one of these sessions, when they took us to the oil fields, very interesting, in Western Siberia, and we went to the headquarters of Gazprom, which is amazing when you sit there and you see this map, illuminated map on the wall, and you see all the pipelines and the lights going off and on. Picture is worth 1,000 words. And I asked President Putin, is Russia an energy superpower? And he said, no. He said, superpower, that's a Cold War term. We don't use that anymore. But he said, we do have more energy than anyone else in the world. And, and we like to sell our energy. So clearly, and of course, Russia's economy grew so much from 2002 to 2008, the first 8 years of, or 7.5 years really, of President Putin's term in office, because oil prices were rising. They got to $140 a barrel before the crash. And so obviously Russia's very significant and impressive economic growth rates were based on that. So certainly Russia has used its energy supplies to reassert itself on the world stage. It is a major supply of energy to Europe. Europeans depending, Finland gets 100% of its natural gas, I think, from Russia. The former East European countries get a large amount of their gas, but so does Western Europe. And that has been a very important way through these gas pipelines that you establish an interdependence. And so when Russia did use this gas leverage, again, it was against Ukraine. It turned off the gas tap to Ukraine on January the 1st, 2006, because the Ukrainians actually hadn't paid their bills. And the Russians were trying to raise their energy prices. But immediately when Gazprom said we're not supplying gas anymore, most people look at Gazprom and they think, what's the difference between Gazprom, this behemoth Russian energy company, and the Kremlin, right? There are ties between them. And so that's been one of the problems, is where does the Kremlin end and where does Gazprom begin? But anyway, and so when that happened, the Ukrainians then siphoned off gas that was supposed to go to Europe. At that point, 80% of Russia's gas that was supplies to Europe went through Ukraine. The figure's much lower now because there are alternate pipelines, or it's 50% now, but it's still an important amount. So in that case, the Europeans suffered, and that's when the Germans, and Germany happened to have the presidency then of the European Union, really said, you can't do this to us. And so the next time they turned off the gas tap, which they did again in 2009, there were other arrangements in play. So Russia does have some leverage as a gas supplier to Europe, but it's interdependence. And of course now Russia is looking much more to supply China, which it already is, and other Asian markets.
But my understanding is that those Asian markets are never going to make up for the importance to the European market. So doesn't that still mean that for Russia, a close relationship with Europe is still fundamental to its economic future?
Oh, yes, and it's not only the gas. I mean, it's Russia and Europe have close economic relationships. I mean, you've heard, apparently something leaked from Prime Minister Cameron saying, we have to go very easy on sanctions against Russia. I mean, it's not only the energy trade, it's Russian business is, very active in Europe, and then European businesses have a lot of equities in Russia, banks, never mind the real estate market in London. So, I mean, Russia and Europe are much more, economically intertwined, and therefore there are limits to how far I think Europeans would go in imposing any sanctions on Russia, or to which Russia would go in, making life more difficult economically for the Europeans.
So there's always been this sort of debate in Russia. It goes back to the 19th century. Is Russia part of the West? Is it is it really part of Europe? Is it part of a European civilization, or is it its own civilization? There's been a sort of resurgence of a discussion of the ideas of Eurasianism, of in the primacy of the Russian Orthodox Church as a kind of other center of a religious-based civilization. Do you see that kind of discussion actually influencing the way the Russians think about a situation like Ukraine? How important is Ukraine in the Russian mind from the point of view of identity?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, Russia is both Eurasian and Asian. But the problem for the Russians is Asians don't regard Russians as Asians. And Europeans regard Russians, I mean, I'm exaggerating now, as not quite European, but nearly European. Because Russia is culturally European, obviously, and Russian culture, European culture are really intertwined. But the idea of kind of Eurasianism is really that Russia has a destiny that's different from the West. And I think under Mikhail Gorbachev and under Boris Yeltsin, we thought that Russia was kind of moving away from that and firmly saying we are part of the West, of the kind of Western institutions, the rule of law, kind of the values that we associate, with the Enlightenment and everything else. What you see now, and you've seen it very much on display, is President Putin, with the Russian Orthodox Church saying we're a different civilization. But now they're saying we're actually the true heirs of Christian civilization. And we heard that in our meetings in September when we were there, both from President Putin and from representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church. We represent true Christian values. The West has lost its way. It's become immoral because of all of these bits of social legislation of which we disapprove, satanic. But also saying, our civilization is equally valid and in some ways superior, particularly on some of these social and moral questions. Now, this is nothing new, as you know, in Russian history. That's what happened under the Tsars. Under the communists, it was that communism was a superior, civilization, if not, political system. But you see that very much now, and I think Ukraine is part of that in as much as, obviously it's complicated religiously in Ukraine because some people, they have the Uniate Church and then some of them adhere more to the Russian Orthodox Church. But anyway, it's part of this identity as a separate Eurasian civilization.
And is that part of the discussion in Russia or the continuing aspiration in Russia to be a great power? And that sort of brings up a question which was asked by someone in the audience. So what is the basis for the Russians to claim in their own minds to be a great power? Is it simply the remnants of the nuclear weapons establishment that was built up during the Soviet era, or is there some other basis on which Russians can say we should be regarded as as you talk about their desire to be regarded as an equal power particularly to the United States?
Well, there are four things really. Location, nukes, United Nations Security Council, and natural resources. So this is a country, the largest country in the earth, that straddles if you go back to Halford Mackinder, the heartland of the world. And the size has been very important also, Russia's size, and I think its own conceptions of itself. Secondly, it is the world's other nuclear superpower. Thirdly, it does have a permanent seat and veto in the United Nations Security Council. And fourthly, it does have huge amounts of natural resources, not only energy, but other resources too, precious metals and things like that. And so all of those things, I think, enable Russia to exercise an influence which is maybe not quite proportionate if you look at its actual economics, the size of the Russian economy, and the fact that it is a raw materials exporter. So I think on that basis, it's able to, as people say, punch above its weight and exercise this kind of influence.
So someone asks if the perception of weakness on the part of the United States and American foreign policy played a role in the Russian calculations in, for instance, moving into Crimea.
Right. I just came from a meeting over the weekend of mainly Republican people, and they were all, criticizing President Obama, and if only he'd been tougher, this wouldn't have happened. I find that very difficult to believe. I mean, I think the U.S.-Russian relationship was at a nadir anyway because of Snowden, and then once President Obama canceled that summit. I think the Russians also calculated no one's going to go to war with Russia over Crimea or Ukraine. And therefore, I think this has now been exaggerated. And I think the Russians must be sitting and looking with great interest at this debate that's going on here on kind of who lost Ukraine. And if only we'd been tougher, it would have been different. I really don't think so. But having said that, I think that for some time, the Kremlin has viewed both the Europeans and the U.S. as being in decline, economically and globally. And they understand that China is a rising power. That's a complex issue for them. So I think in general, they've looked at the West as being in decline, and therefore, they've thought about different alignments. But I don't think you can really, put this down to the actions of the White House.
So someone else asked whether this is a moment when the Germans, in particular, and another Angela Merkel, could step in and play a leadership role in a crisis like this. Why does it always have to be the United States that's out front? Isn't this, we know that Merkel has a good relationship with Putin. The Germans are the primary economic partner to Russia these days, and in many ways they probably know Russia better than anybody else does. Is this a time for German leadership in the context of Europe?
Well, I think it definitely is. I mean, I think Chancellor Merkel in Germany in general has seen itself more as an intermediary between the United States and Russia. I quote in my book a former German general who accused the United States some time ago of having empathy deficit disorder when dealing with Russia, that the U.S. doesn't understand where Russia's coming from in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the difficulties of adjusting to its new status. And I think Germany, of all countries, understands much more what it's like to be a defeated great power, albeit, of course, Germany was defeated in a war and the Soviet Union died of its own self-inflicted wounds, but understands that more. And because Germany has a very close economic relationship with Russia, and because Germany is still grateful to Russia for having allowed Germany to reunify peacefully, there's a legacy, I think, still a residue of goodwill there towards Russia, although not among, all Germans. So I think certainly Germany can play a leadership role. I think Chancellor Merkel is the one who's been talking to President Putin more than anyone else in the last few weeks. And I think, it's interesting at the Munich Security Conference at the end of January, which I attended, the new German foreign minister and the new defense minister both stood up and said, and the president of Germany, a former East German dissident pastor, all stood up and said, Germany has to get over its complex of not wanting to act more forcefully in international affairs. We need to do more, given our, the size of our economy and our strength, we need to do it. So I think it would be time to do that.
So it takes us back to a little bit to the situation in Ukraine and particularly in Kiev. So, and several questioners asked about this. As you recounted, the process of trying to successfully create a government in Kiev that can rule all of Ukraine effectively without corruption, or at least large-scale corruption, and with some degree of rational economic policy, has been pretty difficult. I mean, we've seen failed government after failed government. And by all accounts, the Ukrainians are pretty much broke, and the Russians know this. They put $15 billion on the table in an attempt to influence the sequence of events, the most recent sequence of events in Kiev. What is the West, and this takes us both to EU and Germany, but also to the US, really prepared to take on the burden of a Ukraine that has really had, it may not be a failed state, but let us say it hasn't been a successful state. And that could be a pretty big price tag.
Yeah, and I mean, if you go back to the early 90s, for a time, Ukraine was the third largest recipient of American aid after Israel and Egypt. We poured a lot of money into Ukraine. And what happened was, and the IMF did, you've had a series of governments in Ukraine since its independence that have squandered these resources because, they've gone into people's pockets. So I think everyone, and that's why in a way I think the European Union wasn't prepared when it negotiated the last agreement with President Yanukovych to give more assistance. I mean, we've now criticized them for that, but how much are we willing to give? So I think it's a real dilemma because I think everyone knows you're going to have to really, as much as you can, watch and have some kind of control, conditionality over what happens to that money. But there's only a limit to how much you can oversee that. And I think Europe now will be prepared to do more. I guess the U.S. has offered $1 billion so far in loan guarantees. The Congress is still debating this. It's held up because of other issues. But there's a certain amount of reluctance, even though there's a recognition that we have to do it because Ukraine, is on the brink of bankruptcy and defaulting and things like that.
Well, the Ukrainian prime minister is coming to Washington. There's a lot of overblown rhetoric these days in Washington about everything, but including about Ukraine and the importance of the Ukrainian situation. And as you say, Congress, there's a lot of talk, but I haven't seen a lot of people willing to walk the walk when it comes to putting money on the table. Do you see any sign that either in the administration or in Congress, there's a willingness to really take on the burden of building a viable state in Ukraine?
I think there's still great reluctance. I mean, in Congress, it's now held up, additional assistance because they want the IMF to change, they're critical of the way the IMF is organized, and therefore, they're not voting on this bill. So I think that we've heard a lot of rhetoric. I'm not sure how much of it's really going to be matched by, dollars and cents. And I think that the message to the new Ukrainian government will have to be, yes, we'll give you some more support, but you really have to clean up your act. And you have to make sure that the next government in Ukraine isn't again dominated by different oligarchs, and untransparent. So I would predict that, there's going to be a limit to how much we're going to give Ukraine.
So why shouldn't the Russians be pretty cynical about what the West is saying and doing in Ukraine these days? That in the end, Ukraine matters a lot to Russia. It's essential to Russia, but it's not really that important to the West. So all they have to do really is sit back and wait, and eventually Ukraine comes back to them, as it has repeatedly over the last 10 years since the Orange Revolution.
Yeah, I think that's probably the mindset that would be that they're in this game for the long term. Ukraine is right next to Russia, and it matters more to Russia than it does to either the European Union or the United States. I mean, that's the reality. So I think that's how you proceed. On the other hand, because what's happened now has been so much accompanied by, by violence, by sending troops, by intimidation, I think in the short run, that necessitates a Western reaction, which is maybe more than the Russians had counted for. But in the long run, yeah, I think they will anticipate that this could die down. You could get a new equilibrium, and then you go forth from there.
So the Russians argue that, well, we were ready to make a deal, implement the deal that was negotiated, the three-way deal that was negotiated with Yanukovych to have elections in December. It's the West who sabotaged that. So why not just return to our vision of way things should proceed in Ukraine?
Well, that you can't do that now because Yanukovych fled, right? We don't really know why he fled. I mean, for whatever reason, because they signed this deal. So that status quo is gone. He's not going to go back and be, president of Ukraine. And Putin basically said that in his press conference. So that's a non-starter. So eventually, everyone is going to have to work together, and the Russians are going to have to talk to the current and then future Ukrainian government.
So let me sort of come back to, in some sense, your book and in some sense, the big questions that we started with. And this is, again, a question that comes from the audience. There is, I think, some apprehension that you feel out there that maybe we're heading towards, again, a new Cold War with Russia, that all of the progress that we made towards building some degree of partnership with Russia in the last 20-odd years is now in danger of being flushed away, and that we're going to be heading into a period of long, icy relations with Russia. Is that too pessimistic of you?
Well, it feels like the Cold War with some of the rhetoric that's going around, but it's not the Cold War. We don't have our nuclear weapons targeted at each other, although I guess we could if we wanted to. We're not ideological antagonists trying to kind of carve up the world between communism and capitalism. So that's really different. And then the real difference is Russia is integrated into the global economy in a way that the Soviet Union wasn't. And therefore, policies that Russia pursues have economic repercussions. And so you had the Russian stock market tank after the occupation of Crimea. The value of the ruble fell. Now it's come up again because people feel that maybe it's not going to move beyond Crimea. But that works both ways too, which is, again, you see that you can is the economy, are we now with mutual economic deterrence? We used to have mutual assured destruction. Is it the economic relationship that's where there's a parallel? Because what you now have is we can threaten sanctions and the Europeans can, but as I've said, we're going to lose as well, and the Europeans are going to lose a lot more if they're tough sanctions. The Russians will lose too. So in a sense, this economic integration and Russia being part of the global economy really does change the way that everyone interacts with each other, and it actually, constrains the ability of either side to punish the other one too much.
Some have suggested that maybe the Russian oligarchs, much sometimes reviled Russian oligarchs, may be the saviors of this situation, and that they're the ones whose economic interests, including their assets parked away in Western bank accounts, are most threatened by a new round of tensions, and that they may exert their influence in Moscow in some way. Right.
I mean, I think that's certainly people are discussing that, and people are also saying, if this went too far, if there really were more, violent incursions in eastern Ukraine, then at some point, some of these groups might think, this isn't any good for us because we don't, we want to be able to travel to Europe and, live in the houses that we have there and educate our children there, and we want to have visas. So I think in a way that can act also as a constraint on what Russia might do in the future. But you can never be completely certain in this system where there's so much that we don't understand about how decisions are made.
So if you were sitting in the White House these days, if you were advising the president, what would be your sort of bottom line right now about the message that he should be sending to President Putin?
Well, I think the message has to be that whatever happens with Crimea, and assuming that Crimea then joins Russia, that has to be it. that there cannot be any further erosion of Ukraine's territorial integrity. I mean, that would seem to be the bottom line. And then I think the message has to be, we have to start talking about better ways to regulate that. But again, it's not going to be an easy conversation.
Well, that concludes our program for this evening. And on behalf of the Commonwealth Club and the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Angela Stent for this excellent discussion. I think we've probably exhausted almost every question that certainly the audience had and that I had. And I want to thank the audience for their questions and, of course, our guests. So.